Good morning. I didn't get to pick my walk-up song as I sometimes do, but that worked very well, so you guys did a good job. So I'd like to take a minute to introduce our fabulous panel of my favorite types of people, mayors. Get to spend my life working with mayors, so this is an exciting opportunity for me. So first up, we have Mayor Meredith Leidy with North Glen, Colorado. Mayor Turnip Speed with Eagle, Colorado. And I will still call you Mayor Becker, because once a mayor, always a mayor, from Salt Lake City, the former mayor of, you were Mayor 34 of Salt Lake City, I believe?
Sounds like a good number.
That's what Google says, so we're gonna go with that. So I'm really excited to be here today, one, because this is my first summit, and yesterday was really inspiring and so much energy and good information that I know I gathered, and I'm sure all of you guys did. But really, I think, for me, just looking at the moment we're in, we have such a unique opportunity, and reflecting on the conversation yesterday, I know I can see the promised land, and I feel like we're really at the cusp here, and it's really exciting. So I run an organization called Climate Mayors. I've had the privilege of supporting over 350 mayors from all across the United States. We were founded a decade ago, and we've had mayors that have been setting ambitious climate goals and climate action plans and really paving the way in their communities at a point when, for the most part, there was not a friendly administration. So our organization really grew exponentially at a time when Trump pulled out of the Paris Agreement, when there was a huge vacuum in national leadership, and we had cities, we had states step in and say, we're still in, we still believe in this. And so we grew exponentially at that time, and now we're in a position where we've laid this very solid foundation. We have ambitious goals and plans, and we have an administration that is heavily investing. We've got unprecedented federal dollars going into this work, and we have mayors and local leaders and private sector actors in this room that are ready to meet that moment. So really excited to be at that cusp with all of you and to dive into how our mayors here are looking at meeting that moment locally. So I wanted to just start out with a conversation and some reflections around, as we move towards more of an implementation window, how do you look at communicating around climate change in your communities, and how do you use those communication tactics to build allyship, to build support for ambitious climate initiatives? We'll start with you, Mayor Leidy.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for having us, and it is lovely to be in a room of like-minded leaders, for sure. I heard it was a safe space, so we're going to have a candid conversation, I believe. I think that question is actually two parts, right? How do we communicate with our residents? How do we build that excitement and enthusiasm for climate work? But also, how do we do that regionally? So, you know, I love the diversity of this panel. I happen to be a suburb of Denver, so I'm part of the metro region. So some of the work that we do is really connected to the broader metro Denver. And so how do we communicate regionally with our partners? How do we communicate with our state legislators? And how do we communicate with our residents, right? So it's all of those pieces. I think the residents, we build excitement through community events. We build excitement through education. So my full-time job is I'm an elementary principal, and so education is at the forefront of my mind. But actually, when I was driving up today, I was like, oh, I actually went to Minturn Middle School. And it was kind of like coming home. But I remember as a student, we would write letters because there was a landfill right across the street from our school. And our teachers spent the time with us to teach how to be politically active. And so I do believe that it starts with education at all levels, right? We do the climate work from preschool on up, but we also need to educate our residents, make sure they understand the importance, make sure they understand how it will support our budget, how it supports us economically and also socially. So I want to pass it on. So what do you think?
I guess
My take's just a little bit different. What we did in Eagle is we set what most people are calling a very ambitious goal. And I think once that goal was made into a resolution passed by the council, it's a very clear signal to the community and our staff both about where the council wanted to go with sustainability and climate change action. And once that is out there, and then it becomes a lot easier to communicate that to your citizens, your residents, your business owners, and your staff, and it starts to become integrated into our plans within the council, and it just becomes a lot easier to communicate that when you have that very specific set goal. And our goal is, we have two goals. One is 2028 for our town operations. The other is 2030 for our community as a whole. And once that was established, it really helped our organization start to move forward.
Mayor Becker, I'd love for you to dive into the state piece of this as well, because you served in the State House of Representatives in Utah as well. So I know you served at a time where climate change was a dirty word. So can you talk through how you were able to shift some of those dynamics?
Yeah, fortunately, I think I can say that times have changed, even in Utah to a large extent. But I think in terms of communications, I'm from a bigger city, but I think the realities that we deal with in our resort communities in bigger cities isn't that different in the sense that in many of our states, we've got states that are not very amenable, supportive, or taking action around climate. And so for me, I was mayor from 2008 through 2015, and while climate was the leading agenda item for me, I did not put climate change as a term out front because I didn't want to have to deal with the resistance at the state level, and I wanted to appeal as many people as possible. Yesterday you heard some really great discussions about communication, and I think talking about it locally is the best way to be able to help everyone understand this is not a mythical, legendary, mystical issue. This is right at home. This is our snowpack, this is our water supply, this is our air quality, and this is the future for our kids. And so I never used the term for a long time, climate change. I talked in terms of agenda for a livable community, how we become a great city, how we become the most livable, attractive city for people to live and work and play in. And in my environment, that enabled me to, I think, reach a much broader group. And then if it's coupled with really having a very specific agenda, and elected officials are known for just getting out in front and doing op-eds, but it's the behind-the-scenes work we all know is where things get done. And so we had an agenda. We called it our Sustainability Livable City Agenda. We had 80-plus action steps around every element of a city's actions, internally and externally. We put up a dashboard around every one of those items with a timeline and how we were doing. So having, and a lot of you, I've really been impressed, have been developing climate action plans and have very specific actions you're working on. But the context makes a difference. In a state like Utah, if we were to step out in Salt Lake City, the bright blue dot in the deep Red Sea, we would get creamed. They would just override a lot of what we were doing. So different states, Colorado, you're in a very welcoming environment. But if you're in Idaho or Montana or Wyoming, it's a different world. And so all those, in my mind, all those things from an elected official's point of view need to be taken into account.
Yeah, and working with mayors who are in states all over the United States, I can say that some of the state preemption issues have been huge. And with all the federal dollars, the majority of the federal dollars flowing through state energy or state transportation offices, it can be a real challenge when you have that difference in climate leadership. So I want to move into some of the political continuity challenges. So you have your climate action plan, you set an ambitious goal, you fight the fight to get there. How do you keep that embedded in the culture of your city, knowing that, I know you're running for re-election right now, you have a couple council members that are also up for re-election. How do you ensure that continuity and that success moving forward?
That is such a timely question. So I have a council of 9, and 7 of us are on the ballot in November, and that is due to just transition, right? People move, and then we have appointments, and so we have some 2-year seats. And with those appointments, we had some different opinions come on board, and they have started to push back on the work that we've started. Our sustainability coordinator position is the #1 kind of debatable topic. We have a gentleman who claims to be fiscally responsible, as if not hiring a sustainability coordinator is like it's an indulgence, and it's not. And so we know that it's a necessary thing. That's how we're going to get our climate action plan up and running. And this is embedded work that our city staff has done. So one thing I've noticed over the last couple weeks is that my city staff is getting very nervous and anxious. And so I have to be really intentional about my own election, right? And working with colleagues, making sure that if I'm knocking on doors, I'm knocking on doors to support people that are going to support our climate work, because it's so important. And we can't take elections for granted, because as you know, anyone can run for local office. And so it's so important, and even one voice can shift the entire council direction, and it's too important to ignore. So we are working collaboratively as we run for office. We're not running as a panel, but we're definitely running in support of one another so that we can keep these goals moving forward. And it's important to educate not only the residents, but also council members. So I can think of one gentleman who came on board, and he's very kind. He just doesn't have the background and the information that he needs to support some of the work. And so there's some strategy there, right? If an upcoming vote is really important around our budget and the sustainability coordinator position, we need to educate those council members who may not understand how important it is, and then find that way to make it make sense to them, right? Find meaning. So if someone's saying, well, we can't afford it, we absolutely can. Let me show you how, right? And so I have felt like my job as mayor is to build that bridge with my council, making sure the other 8 really understand the why behind the decisions that we make, so that we're not making uninformed decisions.
Sort of like I mentioned before, we set this goal. There's a few people out there in the audience, I think, that heard this story a little bit last year, but it's new for us. We're a couple years into this journey, and what I've noticed in terms of not really having to worry about elections so much is, once we had the goal, it now becomes part of our strategic plan, it becomes part of our major objectives, and you set a culture within the organization that can withstand at least a certain amount of elections. I don't know about 7 out of 9 would be a little bit tough, but we have an election coming up too. It's 3 members, and I'm confident that no matter how that goes, we're going to be fine with what we're working on. And I do think, especially as a smaller town, and North Glen's not huge, but it's not as small as Eagle, we've made some strides. We've already hired a sustainability specialist. We hired a town manager who's passionate about climate change and sustainability. And once you set that within your organization, it really helps withstand some elections, I would think.
So as a former mayor, you have an interesting perspective. Do you have some thoughts on what was successful in terms of sticking after you left office?
Yeah, maybe a little bit in terms of communications. I think, what's being described here is those of us, and what the internal workings are like with our councils and with others. But I guess I would divide it sort of into 2 categories. One is internally. I mean, we have to work with our councils, we have to work with our employees, and then we have to work on the other side of it. We have to work with the broader community and with regionally and with state officials as well. And internally, it's much more of reminding people, here's what we're trying to do, and here's how we're trying to do it. And every time we put in a bike lane, the people on the street would have a fit, And, we'd have to listen to people, spend the time with people, work through it, but not back off because there was a very loud and obviously very vocal opposition to a change on their street. So some of it is keeping the vision out there of what we're doing and how we're doing and how we're trying to accomplish it. With the outside world of our city, where we had really good support within our city generally, it's much more about relationships. It's much more about building relationships with others in our region, other local government officials, with the private sector, both profit and nonprofit, and then in our case, with state officials. I had the benefit of serving 6 terms in the House, and I knew the state legislators. I knew how their wheels turned. And so, for me, I would spend time before we'd announce something that I thought was going to be controversial in that other world, letting people know what we had coming up, and notification with people who might naturally seem like opponents makes an enormous difference in having people be more acceptable of something that they might necessarily just may not agree with. So anyway, it's that mix, I think, of being able to communicate internally, externally, and then keeping, here's what we're trying to do, and here's how this fits into it.
One of the conversations that came up yesterday was around equity and how we make sure that this transition is equitable. That is a priority for the Biden administration with the Justice 40 initiative, 40% of funding going to the communities that are underserved and need it the most. But I want to hear from each of you, what does that look like in your communities? How do you make sure that as you move forward on your climate agenda, that it really is supporting your community members that need it the most?
So a couple years ago, we started the DICE board, Diversity, Inclusivity, and Social Equity. And that is a group of residents that are volunteering their time to really filter everything that we do through that lens. And they are an advisement board to council. They bring guest speakers in. They are reaching out to the residents for that very purpose. And so that's our number one tool right now. I know our staff is always thinking through that lens, but it is really important to have a group of residents that are helping as well and making sure that we don't miss anything. So that's our number one strategy, is our DICE board.
Yeah, more, I guess, not so much strategies, but some examples of what we've done in the town of Eagle. Some of them are, fairly minor, but supporting different rebates for EV vehicles, electric bikes, and then with our goal, we now have a roadmap on how we're trying to reach the goal. And one of the big things, as we all know, is transportation and housing. So we were fortunate to receive a $1.1 million grant for Habitat for Humanity in the school district in conjunction with Eagle County, able to build a number of homes right next to a school so that teachers could live and not have to commute to work, and just trying to provide some, a little bit of equity in that situation. So, and we keep it in the forefront of our mind also, but we don't quite have the DICE thing yet or anything, but.
Yeah, I've got to say, I'm really glad to see that the equity issue has become a central theme in how we address climate change. People who aren't from Utah or Salt Lake may not realize in Salt Lake we're a majority minority school district, and we're probably pretty quickly approaching, people say by 2040 we'll be a majority minority community. That is, the majority of our community are minorities. And there is very clear demarcations of areas of our city that suffer from historical environmental injustice. And so those areas, in my mind, I think, and I think we're seeing this increasingly around the country, those areas need additional emphasis when it comes to the impacts from climate change in our region. That may be flooding, it may be fire exposure, but certainly around all of the other injustices, whether it's hazardous waste or clean air, or water quality even, or access to recreation. So I think that what we're seeing is a real emphasis. We had probably the ugliest street in town that was going through our west side of the airport called North Temple. We had to go through a lot, but we built a light rail line from downtown to the airport along that road. We overhauled that road to where it is the most attractive arterial now in the city. And we're seeing the development around that road now completely convert to a place that is really attractive, and as I said, used to be ugly, unattractive, and wasn't inviting for either residents or businesses. So those kinds of infrastructure investments, which is where cities really can play a big role, and then some service alterations can really make a big difference.
I'm going to ask one more round and then open it up to audience questions, so be prepared. So we're in this moment where we have unprecedented levels of funding. We're starting to see some of that funding coming down. So I'd love to hear from each of you. What's the one thing that you're most excited about pursuing in 2024? What's next on your climate agenda?
Oh, that's real exciting. So we have a couple of fun things happening in North Glen. You should come visit us. But we're building a net zero city hall that is coming. It's under construction now, and the technology there is pretty exciting. We are moving toward electrifying our fleet, and that is it's a multi-step process, as you know, so we're moving in that direction. And just yesterday, actually, we hosted the EPA, and I know they're here this afternoon, because Adams County and Jefferson County received over $600,000 for air quality monitors, and that is really giving our residents access to the data around the air quality. And so those are just small examples of what we have going on, but really in North Glen, we say we're small but mighty, and we want to go first. So we want to go first with the electrification of our fleet as we can in the region, and then also going first with our net zero city hall. So those are two really big steps for us, but really it's about those regional partnerships. So we work really closely with Adams County and the metro region to get that work done as well. But it's super exciting, and those are just small examples. We have a whole plan of a lot of fun things, so if you're around, come see us.
Yeah, our biggest project probably for the upcoming year is we're doing a $1.5 million solar installation at our biggest electrical, I can't, at a loss for words, sorry, but our water and wastewater treatment plant. And that was done as part, we got a big grant from Department of Energy for that. And then we are in the middle of electrifying our fleet as well. We're also updating our building codes. That's coming up in the next couple of weeks to move more towards electrification. And that's probably our biggest, one-off things right now coming up.
Mayor Becker, if you still were wearing the mayor's hat, what would be the one thing you'd be hoping to accomplish?
Well, I think we all know that the biggest contributors to greenhouse gases in our communities and really in the country are around buildings and transportation. And if I were mayor still now, I mean, we built a light rail line, a streetcar line, and did some massive improvements around transportation. We did the first net zero public safety building in the country. We set LEED Gold as our minimum standards for buildings, built a solar farm. We did a bunch of stuff. But now I think what I would focus on, and we've got a LEED Gold standard for private sector as well. I think I would focus on the transportation sector and really making transit, bikes, pedestrians as accessible and friendly and convenient as automobiles. We have so far to go in our communities to achieve that, and it takes a major investment, and in our state, highways, are invested in 5-to-1 over transit, and that's not a good formula to make that change.
Well, luckily, there's a lot of funding for that now between the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act. Questions from the audience? I can't see, so I guess just jump in.
Hi, good morning. My name is Niffy. I'm with Year Out Energy. Yesterday and today already, I believe that we've heard consistent messaging that I perceived as pitting political partisans against one another. Climate change doesn't care who you voted for in the last election. So how is it that we can change our rhetoric to be more inclusive and bring all on board in fighting something that's going to be affecting all of us for the next generation?
Can I jump in? The only reason I wanted to start is because running for election right now, I'm knocking on doors and I'm having those conversations very intimately, one-on-one with residents, and I think it's very similar to what you have shared as far as setting the stage. It's not about climate change. It's about living in a sustainable world where we can all breathe. So some of that is those personal stories, learning about them, building that relationship, and then being able to tie it to something that's meaningful to them. So it might be a grandchild with asthma. It might be a grandparent that is on an oxygen tank. So there's things that we can use, but we have to be knowledgeable enough to anchor to it. But you're totally right. It is not a partisan issue, and we need to push past that and make sure that everyone understands the importance of our environment.
And Eagle, when you run for the council, you're not a Republican or a Democrat, so we don't really have that. But one thing that is interesting to note is when we did pass our resolution, it was a 7-0 vote, and there was diversity on the council, some right, some left. But when it came down to it, it was a very clear 7-0 vote. So it was very helpful for our organization to have the support like that.
Yeah, I think this was talked about yesterday quite a bit too, and we've been talking about it here. Talking about polar bears is great. A lot of us are into climate change, can talk about the Arctic and talk about polar bears, but it's the local issues that people can really relate to. So if you talk in terms of water, snowpack, in your communities, those are huge as they are throughout the West. Air quality as it affects people personally. I mean, those are the things that help resonate with people regardless of their ideology.
So very, very similar vein in questioning was the partisanship. I guess a two-pronged question. In the back doors, when you are talking to other people, is it as bipartisan as it seems to the public when you're having other conversations with trying to actually get the policy pushed through? And then the second part of the question is, would you say a better path to change is at a local level or state level or federal level?
Ooh, that's a big question. I would say you're probably right. Behind closed doors, it is a little more partisan than we would like it to be. And so that is where we have to kind of get the votes, right? If I'm leading a council of 9, I need to make sure I have enough to move forward. I do have a couple, again, safe space, of stubborn council members that are really not interested in this work. And so I need to make sure that the rest of us are on board so that the votes go through. We do have some that are 9-0, but lately I have some very stubborn that they just don't want to spend the money on this work. So that is a concern. The other thing that we have to do is partner with our state legislators, and so I am fortunate that one of my former council members is now a state representative, and she's extremely passionate about this work. And so we can stay in communication, and at times she can kind of lean on her former council members to really push. And so sometimes it is like, hey, this is important work. We have to vote in the right way to keep this moving. But there's also a piece of how do we explain to everyone the financial benefit to it. They see it as an expense, but they don't see it as something that we are going to actually recoup. And so if we can frame it for some of our number brains in the group, we can get them to understand that it does have value. I'm not quite sure at what level is most important. I know if we can leverage federal funding, but it trickles down. And so some of our funding goes to the county. So we have to partner with our county commissioners in order to see it. But I'm also in the metro region, so it might be a little different.
Yeah, I think I've been very fortunate. We haven't had a lot of that in Eagle, luckily, as far as the bipartisan. All of our things that we voted on so far have been 7-0. And so you try to build the consensus, obviously, and make it happen. But I think a lot of the stuff that Ralph's been talking about has really struck home with me, because when we started this journey, through some of the coaching from Luke Carton, the dumpster diver over here, he was very insightful for us not to talk about metric tons of carbon, et cetera. Get it more on the local level, what affects your community. And that was some of the stuff that we started working on, bike lanes, multimodal transportation. We did just recently pass a new waste diversion program for Eagle, where we're doing single stream recycling and curbside composting. And all of this is passed without any real, fortunately for us, no real heartache. We all know it's the right direction to move in, and we've gotten everybody on board to be able to do that.
Yeah, so I've been around in this arena for a long time, maybe too long. But we live in the most hyper-partisan era politically that is imaginable for me. And unfortunately, climate change has become a partisan issue, and it gets people riled up, unfortunately, in ways that are just totally unacceptable. This is not a partisan issue. This is an issue that affects every single one of us in our futures. But I think we have to just recognize that and work with it. And it's changing. The question is it changing fast enough? And I think what we heard yesterday, and I know I maintain, is that we really can have a hopeful future. If you think about the information, 80% of the population in this country lives in cities, 90% of the GDP is in cities, 75% of the greenhouse gas emissions are coming from cities. So if we at the local level take the lead, and I'm so encouraged and thankful for what's happened, with the IRA and the infrastructure laws. But if we take the action at the local level, we can make the change ourselves. We've got to deal with state pushback in some places. Fortunately, that's decreasing. But I think it really is incumbent on us at the local level to take our communities and make them the places we want them to be.
Do we have other questions? Got a couple questions here.
Oh, thank you.
It was pretty awesome on global modeling. And one thing I learned is that, a multitude of things have to happen to get there. But another thing she put into some of the modeling model is methane-related activities, agriculture, food waste, composting, electrification from gas. And those numbers decreased more because methane is more potent, as we know, and seems like that would be something that would be leading the way to get our emissions numbers down, to focus on methane-related activities, than, at the same time doing many other things. But I'm just wondering, it was great to hear that there was a waste focus there in Eagle, but none of you really mentioned waste as a priority in your councils until I just heard from you. So I'm just wondering what your methane-related activities are as a priority, and why that isn't more of a priority all over, since I learned yesterday that it brings the numbers down the fastest.
So I think that's a great question, and I'm actually going to talk to him later about that. We did do a waste optimization study, and this is a really good example of how a lack of education, a lack of understanding, my council did not vote to move forward. And so that was really frustrating. So we have to go back to the table and make sure that they gain the knowledge that you're talking about and they get a deeper understanding of why that's important. We have residents that are saying we have to have it, we need the composting, we need to move forward, but we didn't have enough understanding on council to move that forward right now. So it's in our sustainability plan, we're still pushing on it, but we have to do that work before we can try again. And it was very disappointing, so I agree.
I think for our organization, and I don't know if you can believe everything you read, but I read something in the New York Times that said food waste contributed more to greenhouse gas emissions than the whole commercial aviation industry. And I was like, wow, well, that seems like a pretty easy low-hanging fruit, right? Let's just take care of that. And we're very fortunate in Eagle. We have a great provider, a great trash hauler who has a compost facility set up in Eagle County. And I would really, really urge everybody in this room, if you're an elected official, to push towards this. This is a very easy, low-hanging fruit. When you go to the composting facility, it's amazing. There's like 9 piles, and it starts, and you first see all the green bags and the compostable cups, and 9 weeks later, it's soil ready to go into your gardens. And it's so direct, and it keeps it so local, and it is one of the big providers. It's not buildings, it's not transportation, but it's a very easy thing to do. And my guess is 10, 20 years from now, almost all communities are going to be doing composting. So why not get out in front of it and do it, now instead of later?
Yeah, so waste is a really important element among 10 others, okay? I really think that when we're talking about climate change, as I said initially, it's a comprehensive approach. You can't just sort of pick one thing and say, oh, hooray, we've got this done. I can tell you that in Salt Lake City, when I started, 10% of our waste was recycled. By the time I left, it was 80%. The biggest contributor wasn't glass or tin or aluminum. It's when we started collecting organics and at our landfill started composting and making that available to the public for free. We also captured all the greenhouse gases coming off our landfill and used that to power the landfill. Since I've left, we are now rebuilding our sewage treatment plant, and they are capturing all the gases there and using that to power. We'd already started powering the sewage treatment plant with gases coming off of the plant, but now they're taking it to a whole nother level to actually export some of the energy that's coming off of waste treatment. So it's a huge issue, but I'll say as it relates to methane, what we're seeing nationally through EPA right now with their regulations, this is a big national issue, and it's not just in landfills, at local government. Some of the biggest contributors are really coming out of the oil and gas fields. What they're doing with their methane regulations, so this is on the stick side of the equation, is incredible. Assuming it holds, it'll get challenged. Assuming it holds, it's going to make a really big difference on methane emissions.
We have time for one last question.
Hi, good morning, everyone. First of all, I'd like to say I'm really excited to hear all the great work that's happening. It's just phenomenal, and this grassroots approach, I think, is going to be the success. Hearing a lot of great stories about, electrification and how we're moving in that direction, but one of the topics I haven't heard too much about has been water. In a recent Wall Street Journal article, I read that Utah is actually looking at building a pipeline to the Gulf of Baja to pump salt water back into the Great Salt Lake because it's so, yeah. And we're laughing, but Phoenix is already doing it to be able to desalinize water, not have to depend on Lake Powell, Lake Mead, and that sort of thing. So one quick topic I'd just like to hear is how maybe this is not a mayoral approach, but just what may be happening in each of these communities to help support water reutilization and that sort of thing. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. So we are very focused on our wastewater treatment plant. And it's probably going to need some infrastructure, and so we're looking for funding for that right now. But when we reach out, I mean, I feel like I'm on a trend of education, but when we reach out to our residents, that is a part of it. So we have a lot of community events, and our wastewater staff, they're so cool. They have all these fun like science experiments and displays and information for residents, because we're still not treating our wastewater properly, number one, and that is a huge problem. So we have to educate residents on how to properly use water, how to save water. We try to educate them on the, incentives and rebates and, what are those little handles, use less water kind of thing. But we really do have to talk to residents about it. And so we have some sort of display at every community event so we can really get the word out. And then infrastructure is something that we're working on as a city, because our wastewater plant is ours and we have to take care of it. But also we have to protect our water source. And our council, we have an IGA with a couple of cities because our water is in the Stanley Lake and we need to make sure that that water is protected. But then there's also the issue of housing, right? We want to build more housing. We want to have affordable housing for everyone. And we want to make sure we have enough water to do that. So being really mindful about our growth as well.
Well, it sounds like a Utah thing. We're going to pump water from Mars or something and get it to solve our problems. Utah's the second most arid state in the country, and so water is huge, obviously, for us. And with the Great Salt Lakes drying up, it presents a whole new challenge and set of issues. It has also been the first time in the state of Utah that we are seeing our state folks begin to change from the appropriation doctrine and prior rights doctrine to how do we use water wisely. And that is the biggest key in our arid states, is just using water more intelligently in an urban area or in some of these areas, not growing bluegrass and using native plants and xeriscaping, and but it's also, so much of it is institutional in just how these water districts coordinate their use of water, not relying on just building more and more infrastructure to supply water. Probably all of our states have transbasin diversions, and that's just what was built in to the way we did things 100 years ago, but that's obviously not the future. But back to the climate change, people understand their water is coming from our mountains, and they understand watershed protection. And when you can begin to talk about how our watersheds are changing and the needs to protect them, and what it's going to cost us in terms of infrastructure changes to accommodate changes in snowpack and how we even collect our water, those things are huge, and everyone can relate to them. It affects them in their pocketbooks, and it affects them in whether or not they're going to have, water for their future. So it's an enormous issue, and so much of it, I think, is just institutional resistance.
Yeah, in terms of water conservation, we're doing a bunch of things, but one thing I think that has been the most effective is we implemented a different tiering structure in your water rates, right? So. And when we had consultants come in, they said, well, that usually works for the first year or two, and then people start using more water. Well, I think we're in year number 4, and this year we have a lot more summer water usage, obviously, than winter. And our summer usage was down the last few years. And so one of the ways for conservation is hitting people in the pocketbook and making them more conscious of their decisions to water bluegrass or whatever they're doing, and it works. I've seen it live in Eagle, so it really is an effective method.
Great conversation. We are at time. Please join me in thanking our fabulous speakers.